Hello, my name's David Bruce. So I wanted to look today at a piece with some pretty advanced tonal harmonies. But before we get into the joys of analysing and using big chord names like B13, sharp 11, flat 9, I wanted to just talk for a minute about why people use these chords. So here, for example, is a standard A major chord. Let's make it a little bit more interesting by adding a B underneath. And now we'll make it even more colourful by adding some sevenths and ninths. And then even more some 11ths and 13ths. So what's the difference between each of these chords? What does it mean to use one and not another? Well, one of the things that this more advanced kind of harmony expresses to me is a sense of richness, maybe even opulence or indulgence. And that might be a good thing or it might not, depending on how you view it. This is one of those areas like desserts where we each have our own preference. What for some might be rich and glorious may for others be sickly and overindulgent. In fact, I think it even depends on your mood as a listener. You can listen to a piece one day and find it full of flavour, and then the next it might sound just too much of a good thing. Personally, I tend to favour music that's quite straightforward, harmonically speaking, sort of raw and open. But from time to time I come across a piece that makes me stop in my tracks and question whether my love of simpler harmonies is right. And I think these more advanced harmonies work best for me when they're written in a gentle, modest tone. They can come across more as a fascinating character you'd like to get to know more about, rather than, say, an obnoxious show-off. And that's what I think's happening in a gorgeous little piece I'd like to focus on today by a composer called June Lee, Pedal Point Etude. Some of you may have come across June before in relation to Jacob Collier. June is a jazz pianist, a singer and a composer, and he's probably most well known for his transcriptions of Jacob's work, which are incredibly detailed and a great source of information in themselves if you want to delve into these more advanced kinds of harmony. What particularly struck me in this work was that the harmony was very difficult to understand through any conventional analysis. There are brief moments of one tonality or another, but how it moves from point to point isn't immediately obvious. It draws me in by making attractive sounds, but keeps me intrigued by the mystery of its construction. We'll come back later to this whole question of gluttony or glory, but let's take a look at this piece for my own education, but hopefully also for yours, and try and understand and explain what's going on. So let's firstly quantify some of the types of chords we can find in the piece. We've already come across one, which is the third of those four chords I showed at the start. These kinds of chords are known as tertiary. They're built by adding thirds on top of a standard triad. They're the most common kind of chord in jazz. So here we have an A major with a seventh and a ninth. Of course, the thirds don't just get plonked one on top of the other. They often get redistributed both for ease of playing and for different kinds of effect. So here the seventh is at the top, but the ninth is played lower down. Here are some of the other tertiary chords throughout June's piece. The next category is chords built from fourths, quartal harmony. So a similar process to the thirds, pile them one on top of another, but sometimes squish the fourths into the same octave. In classical music, Scriabin was one of the first to play with these kind of chords. But you can also find them in Schoenberg, Ravel and others. In jazz, Bill Evans famously used two chords built from fourths at the start of Miles Davis's iconic So What. And later people like McCoy Tyner and Keith Jarrett also used them a lot. I know these are all composers that mean a lot to June, so they're in the background of where his music comes from. And similarly, quintal harmony is built out of fifths. Finally, there are also some bitonal chords which seem to be built out of two triads stacked one on top of the other. These might be two major chords like here, or even two diminished chords, the so-called double diminished here. Many of these more complex jazz chords become very tricky to describe in jazz notation. B13, sharp 11, flat 9. I've always felt that the more complicated these labels get, the less real information they give us. And labelling them like this always implies that they're really just a fancy extension of the underlying chord, that all those extra notes are not much more than a standard chord dressed up in fancy clothes, as Adam Neely put it recently. To me, labelling these chords does little to help me understand what's going on in a piece like June's. I mean, sure, this chord could be labelled a dominant 7th with a flat 9 and a flat 13 in the third inversion on the flattened median of the E major scale. But why did he choose those particular fancy clothes over any other fancy clothes? And how does any one of those fancy chords follow another? Because although the piece sounds quite tonal, if you went through it trying to analyse it in terms of functional harmony, chords and modulations, well, it would get very, very complicated, and I don't think you'd learn very much at all. The key to understanding a piece like this is to try to find some frames of reference outside of the traditional ideas of functional harmony, and there are four I'd like to talk about. First up, voice leading. June has talked a lot on his own channel about the importance of voice leading in his music and the music of Jacob Collier and others.
With some experience in voice leading, you'll be able to separate the upper and lower structure of chords and have them move in different directions.
So we talked about this a bit in my Bach chorale question in last month's Q&A video. The main idea in this context is that the individual notes of a chord will move stepwise to the notes of the next chord. This is a way of creating a connection between chords that may come from quite distant families. So here are two chords. The voice leading here is pretty bad because all three of the notes have to jump to arrive at the next note. Whereas in this case, all three notes move to a neighbouring tone. In this case, it's a semitone or a half step, but moving to a whole tone or a whole step will work just as well. And the chord we arrive at now is only one note different from the chord we tried the first time round. But because of that voice leading, it now sounds smoother and more natural, just sliding from one chord into the next. Just like in those Bach chorales, the idea of voice leading really comes from vocal music. The three notes of those chords would be sung, of course, by three different singers. And although leaps are of course possible in vocal music, it's generally more comfortable for a singer to move to a neighbouring note. There's less that can go wrong. June has talked about how he became interested in voice leading and vocal harmonies in jazz, starting with groups like Manhattan Transfer. And not surprisingly, he was then drawn into Jacob Collier's world. Jacob overdubs his own voice to build huge jazz chords with a lot of focus on voice leading. One thing to point out in June's piece is that unlike the Bach chorales, we don't have to feel the need to stick to a set number of voices throughout. You can see that the number of notes in the chords changes, but in this whole passage almost every single note can be traced to a neighbouring note in the previous and following chords. In fact, I could only find one note, the F natural here, that didn't have a neighbouring note in the preceding chord. The nearest it has is this G sharp. And the clearest example of voice leading here is in the bass line, which just sinks down stepwise from A down to the C sharp. The second trick that June uses quite a lot is really a form of polytonality, but it's quite a specific kind. Here you can see that the notes of June's opening melody fit very comfortably into E major, but beneath that the chords move all over the place. Look at this scale we just picked out in the bass line: A, G sharp, G, F natural, E, D, C sharp over a held B. Now that's not any scale that I know the name of. And it's certainly a long way from the E major of the melody. So let's look instead at some of the individual chords used in this section. This chord has four notes that aren't part of the E major scale. They're more from E flat major. Or in this chord, they're more from C harmonic minor scale. My point really is that having that simple tonality in the melodic dimension allows you to put really quite chromatic chords beneath it and still have a sense of things hanging together. So the next concept I want to look at is the general idea of dissonance in a chord. Perhaps we could find a way to understand the piece through the ebb and flow of dissonance, the rise and fall of tension and release. I looked into the academic research on this, and surprisingly there's not a clearly defined way of describing the level of dissonance a chord has. And I guess that's partly because the level of dissonance you perceive, or the roughness as some researchers call it, depends on a lot of different aspects, including the loudness and particularly the timbre. But essentially I think it comes down to the way the different sound waves from each note interact. Two waves that are quite close together but not in sync, like those produced by a minor second or a minor ninth, will produce almost a kind of beating effect, which I think is generally true to say we perceive as more dissonant. So a chord like this one, which sounds pretty dissonant, is packed with minor ninths. You've got B to C, D to E flat, and G to A flat. A good little rule of thumb here is that if you can find all of the notes of the chord from within a major scale, it'll probably sound fairly good within this kind of lush jazz harmony context. All of those come from an E major. If the notes come from a harmonic minor scale, they'll be more dissonant, and all the notes in this quite dissonant chord come from C harmonic minor. If the chord contains clusters of 2 or 3 chromatic notes that you don't find in any traditional scale, the chord will obviously sound more dissonant. I asked June to subjectively label each of the chords in his piece in terms of its dissonance on a scale of 1 to 10, and then I did the same thing myself. You can see June's scores here in blue and mine are in red. We disagreed on a few, but I think it's fair to say that there was a bit of a rise and fall in these 4 main sections. So in some sense each phrase ends with a sense of release as the tension of the chord and the expectation within it to go somewhere relaxes. And this tension and release idea is really a second aspect of dissonance. The classic example of tension and release is the dominant chord moving to the tonic. So the dominant chord feels like it's trying to resolve onto the tonic. So rather than just thinking of dissonance levels, you could think about the tension levels a chord has in terms of the feeling that it needs to release onto something. It's worth mentioning that for some composers, this whole idea of tension and release, or dissonance resolving onto consonance, is a very romantic 19th century idea. You know, the ebb and flow, the push and pull, the whole concept has been done to death and is no longer relevant. One interesting thing in this context is this chord here, which June said he borrowed from Olivier Messiaen. June told me that he enjoys this chord and that even though it's quite dissonant, it doesn't feel like it needs to resolve anywhere. It reminds me a bit of the famous chord in The Rite of Spring where you have an E flat 7 chord over an E major below. So again, it's very dissonant, but doesn't have a feeling that it needs to resolve anywhere. So it's just worth remembering that although tension and release and dissonance are related, they're not the same thing. Dissonance doesn't always have to find a resolution. So we've looked at using neighbour note voice leading as a way of smoothing the joins between unrelated chords. Another way is to have common tones, shared tones between the two chords. One of the best examples here comes at the end of the first phrase and the start of the second. So we've seen how that first phrase is in a kind of E major, or at least in the melody. But the second jumps suddenly to more of a C major feel. And I was stuck for a while about why, because C is quite a distant key from E. So was it just a deliberate jump, or was there anything more to it than that? One thing I hadn't taken into account was that this chord and the following chord have several tones in common. So even though it is quite a jarring jump to move from E to C, the join is smoothed over a bit by having so many notes in common. And then of course there's one other very significant feature in the piece which joins the chords together through common tones, and that's the pedal tones of the title. The pedal tones are those long held notes in the bass that each underpin a whole series of chords. In a way, your ear accepts anything over the top of a pedal, especially if the final chord of the series has that sense of resolution or consonance. Finally, let's look at the journey of the overall tonality throughout June's piece to see if we can pick up any more clues. We've seen how it opens with an E major melody, and the final section of the whole piece also has an E feel. There's a held B in the bass, the dominant, as if it was preparing for a traditional 5-1 ending. And in fact, if you take out the last two chords, you could easily find a way to end the piece with a resolution on E major. So this in itself provides a bit of a feeling of homecoming in the end of the piece, but the piece actually ends on a D chord. And this was another intriguing question about the piece, which I think June was only partially able to explain to me. Why does it end on D? In most traditional analysis, you would probably describe a sort of unsettled feel if you didn't land back at the home key. But I don't always find that to be true. In this case, the fact that the closing key isn't the same as the opening doesn't really bother me. I actually found that move to D in the piece kind of surprising, but also somehow very touching. And even working out technically how that's achieved is quite tricky. I guess the E major feeling gets kind of squashed out in these last two chords. There's the way that the leading tone D sharp is flattened to a D natural in the melody line. But then there's also a D flat in the bass, which you could see as a C sharp, a leading tone leading towards that final D major chord. So it becomes a kind of all-in-one modulation over that second to last chord. And as June pointed out to me, the same thing happens a bit earlier in the piece. This phrase seems for the most part to be in B major in the melody, but then it shifts down a gear to end in A major. So perhaps this prepares our ears for a similar slip that happens at the end of the piece. In summary, June's piece uses a variety of complex jazz chords, tertiary, quartal, quintal and polytonal. He moves between them focusing heavily on voice leading so that most of the notes in a chord move stepwise from notes in a preceding chord. There's an ebb and flow of tension and resolution, consonance and dissonance. The overall high level of chromaticism is softened not just by the voice leading, but by a strong degree of tonality in sections of the melody, as well as by common tones which bind disparate chords together. And although there is no overall key, there's a subtle sense of return at the end of the piece to the opening sense of E major. So when you try to analyse a piece like this, it's easy to get overwhelmed with the complexities of what's going on. Many of the choices June made will have been intuitive based on years of working with these kind of chords. This little piece is my own attempt to write something which includes some of these more jazzily rich chords, and some of the techniques I've discovered through analysing June's piece. And I found it much harder than I expected. I hope some of these frames of reference I've talked about will help help us all think about how we might use them in our own music. And crucially, I think we should always keep questioning why we're using these more advanced types of harmonies. Like June, I'm a great admirer of Jacob Collier's work, but there are times for me when he uses a large series of these huge, lush, chromatic chords, and it can become a bit too much sometimes, like having just too much of a rich dessert. But in a piece like June's Pedal Point Etude, it's a single chocolate truffle. Yes, it's still rich, but it's also elegant, perfectly formed, and delicious. Can we do another take on that? I don't think I got that quite right. So there are a bunch of really exciting projects ahead in 2020, which I can't wait to share with you. Do follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to keep up with what's going on. Of course, all of this takes a large amount of time and resources, so a particular thank you to my patrons on Patreon who really do make this all possible. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.